When it comes to being human, there is a balance. We must balance our relationship with each other as individuals, as we connect with each individual, and how we understand and connect with the community. And what's the community for Christians?
The church.
That's it, the church, right? So we connect with our community, right? There is, as many Protestant denominations goes, we don't believe that there is no salvation outside the church. We don't go as far as our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters. Mm-hmm. But there is something to be said about that. In my opinion, it is, if I don't look at it as, okay, if you're out of the community, but as a mainline Protestant Reformed Christian, there is a lot of truth within that, is that we must be part of this community. We are not called to be loners. Mm-hmm. We are called to community. So there is something that speaks to me from that statement, right? Mm-hmm. That we belong to a community. We are not called to be individuals. And yet, Guthrie stresses, now hold on now. He says individuality is important. Because if we ignore each of our individuality, that too is inhuman, right? So again, there is this balance of both, right? We cannot go one way and ignore the other side, or go one way and ignore this side. Somewhere in the middle is our answer, right? So both are important, and both are necessary when it comes to being a human being. All right? Any questions about this last chapter? I know it was a long one, but I hope it was interesting for you. All right, next week I'll have copies of this. I already have copies of 12, but as Suhail said, we need chapter 11, not chapter 12. I'm going to take a drink, because that was a lot of reading. I don't know how authors do it, like at book readings, when they read like a 20-page chapter. I'm like, parched. All right, now, I don't want everyone to get excited, because today we're going to start our section on the doctrine of sin. And it says, why don't you just be yourself? That's Guthrie's little tagline. He has little taglines in each of the chapters, which is kind of neat. I kind of like that. So the doctrine of sin. That's our next section. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to say that. I'm just not myself today. She's not really a bad girl. She's just trying to find herself. Why don't you stop pretending that you are something you aren't, and just be yourself? He's not even human. He's just an animal. You'll go to pieces if you don't pull yourself together. That guy thinks he's God Almighty. Right? Some of these statements might sound familiar. Maybe we've said some of these. Maybe some of these have been said about us. But these are statements that should be familiar to us, right? That get tossed around quite a bit. All these everyday expressions we use to talk about ourselves and other people acknowledge the self-contradiction that plagues all our lives. I am not myself, says illogically but realistically. I am not what I am. Trying to find or be or get a hold of myself is admitting the illogical but true predicament we are all in. I am somehow separated from my inmost, truest self. A human being by definition is not and cannot be an animal or God. Yet all of us sometimes act as if we were what we are not and cannot be. The self-contradiction that makes life so hard to understand and live is the symptom of what Christian theology calls sin. That is what we are going to consider in this chapter. We have already, let's see where I am, okay. We have already indirectly defined what sin is. In the last chapter, we learned that to be a human being means that we are created in the image of God. That means life received from and lived for God in a relationship of thankful dependence and active obedience. Life within for our fellow human beings is a relationship of mutual openness and help. And life that is self-affirming and self-fulfilling when we live in community with God and other people. But the more concrete we become about what it means to live as human beings in the image of God, the clearer it becomes that no one, with one exception, has ever lived such a life. And who is that one that Guthrie is highlighting? Jesus, that's right. Jesus of Nazareth. In various ways, all of us try to live without or against God and our fellow human beings, and in doing, deny our own humanity. That is what lies behind the self-contradiction expressed in our daily recognition that we need to be or find or get a hold of ourselves. Our basic problem, to use the strong language of the Heidelberg Catechism, is that though we are our true selves only in community with them, we are prone to hate God and our neighbor. Why do we have such trouble being ourselves, or even knowing for sure what we would be if we were? Why do we so stupidly keep trying to get loose from God or other people when our own humanity depends on living in community with them? Why do we sometimes try to live as if we were animals or to play God? These are the specific questions that concern us now. Before we begin, we must be clear about where we stand when we speak of sin from a Christian point of view. We must take sin very seriously, but not too seriously. Contrary to the impression we are sometimes given, sin is not the main theme and central emphasis of the Christian faith. We see this both when we look at the doctrine of human beings in the image of God and when we look at the doctrine of Christ. In the first place, from the point of view of the doctrine of human beings, we must talk with dead seriousness about ourselves as sinners. But we must not suggest that our sinfulness is the basic truth about what we are. The basic truth is not that we are sinners, but that we are human beings created in the image of God. Sin distorts and twists, wrenches, and contradicts this truth, but it does not change us into something other than what God created us to be. Sin is not stronger than God. In the Bible, even sinful people are still recognized as people in the image of God. We may disobey God and turn against other people, but we cannot really escape them. By our very nature, we are dependent upon and responsible to them. We may refuse to acknowledge, but we cannot escape the relatedness of our lives as humans. Sin may become second nature to us, but it is never really natural. What we are naturally is what God created us to be. All of us are sinners, but our sinfulness is something unnatural. All right? This is why it is such a problem. We keep trying to be what we are not, but we can never bring it off. No matter how hard we try, no matter how we ruin ours or others' lives in the attempt, we can no more really live without God and of neighbor than a chicken can turn itself into a duck and learn to swim. We may kill ourselves and other people trying, but we cannot turn ourselves from the human beings God made us into animals or substitute gods. So, when we think about what Guthrie is saying when it comes to our introduction to the doctrine of sin, is that there is sin out there. To ignore that, is us walking blindly. And we sin. There's no way around that. We sin. We make mistakes. We falter. Hopefully with God's Spirit, we do it less and less. And as we become more Christ-like, it becomes less and less severe. But, we do have that ability to do it. But as Guthrie says, it is not natural. Sometimes we say, well, it's in our nature. And Guthrie would say, we sin, but we are what? We are created in the what? In the image of God, right. So because we are created in the image of God, we were created good. Sin gets in there and kind of mucks things up, right? So we must remember that, yes, we sin, but this is not natural. It's unnatural. And that's what we must understand, right? That it is this unnatural thing that occurs. The natural thing that occurs is that we're created in God's image, right? So it's the exact opposite.
Now, in the genealogy of Jesus
Yes.
in the Gospels, isn't there places where he actually ends up including people, I mean, lots of women, was it prostitute or something?
Yeah, Rahab, I think, is in there. I think Tamar's in there.
So really, we are the product. If Jesus is in his genealogy had prostitutes and stuff,
Sure.
so he's product of quote unquote sin. So it's not. I know it's not natural, but you know what I'm saying. I'm not saying he is sinful, but is that all of us, the reason we're here today alive is because by evolution and everything else, somebody was dumped by something else, and this is how we end up being here. And
Well, yeah.
So
I think Jesus is a product of humanity, like the person of Jesus, right?
Yeah,
You have
yeah.
the deity of
Part
Jesus.
yeah,
Right. There's,
is of that line.
right. So if we believe Christ was when Jesus was incarnate, he's 100% deity,
mhm.
but he's also 100% humanity, right? So yes, so as we look at his human lineage, right, as you talk about the genealogy list, they're people from all walks of life. So you have people, they look at the tribe of Judah and they look at some of these big hitters within ancient Jewish history or biblical history, but there's also people like Rahab in there. And, when we think about someone like Rahab, the first thought that pops into our mind should be, yeah, she's the one that hid the spies.
Yeah.
She's the ones that helped them take out Jericho. And they would have taken out Jericho, but it was easier.
Yeah.
But Rahab, Rahab was a very shrewd woman, smart. She said, yeah, I'll hide you, but you're taking me with you.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be in these walls when they come crumbling down, right? So when we think about, to me, part of the beauty of the genealogies with Jesus is that there are people with all kind of faults in there.
Yeah,
Well, actually, everyone in there
Yeah.
is faulted, broken,
Yeah.
part of that condition.
It's not whitewashed. It's not.
It's not,
Which is-
not, and that's a beautiful
Yeah.
point. It's not whitewashed.
Yeah.
It's not, they didn't, it's interesting when you think about the Bible, well, we're specifically talking about the New Testament now, not everything in there was supposed to make Jesus look good.
Mhm.
There are some things to say like the genealogies and who was within his family history. Jesus dining with, people who society deemed as unclean. Jesus being crucified. How many people do we look at within our own society that we revere as, pillars or a great teacher that has been executed?
Mhm.
How many? You might go back and say, well, so-and-so from the Revolutionary War who was executed. Okay, but these are, very slim, right? So things like crucifixion, and this made it harder for early Christians to promote who Jesus was, because he was offed as a criminal. I mean, so that makes it, some Messiah, you're telling me that this is the Son of God, and the Romans were able to nail him to a cross. So there are things in there that do not make him look good as people would judge, right? So, and to me, I love that point about the Bible, that it's not whitewashed. It's not cleaned up. They didn't make it neat and tidy. That, yes, this is Jesus' genealogy. They are everyday people. Just as we look at our own families and say, oh man, I wish that one wasn't in my family. I wish that DNA wasn't in there. And yet we all have people in our families that we look at and say, oh, but there is. And it wouldn't be our family if all the people weren't there, right? Well, I'm talking about DNA-wise. And yet Jesus is able to overcome all of what it meant to be a man or human for everyone else, right? That he is tempted and he could have easily done it, but he doesn't, right? So this is why when Guthrie he singles him out, like no person has ever done it except one. Yeah. Right, is able, and this is why when we say, well, what is the perfect example of what it means to be a human? And as Christians, we will say, Jesus of Nazareth. And that's the only one. That's our example. That's our example. And good theologians will hone in on that, right? And say, if you want to live a good life, you imitate the life of Christ. That's it. That's it. But yes, that's a great point to bring up, is that, they don't try to whitewash it. They don't try to sugarcoat it. This is Jesus' genealogy, and these are the people in it. Even the people who we think of as the patriarchs, pillars within ancient Judaism or the early church, these people are people. They mess up. They make mistakes. Some of them are horrid mistakes. I mean, when you think about Paul and what he did before he is converted and brought on board, I mean, there's a reason why when Jesus comes to, why can I never remember his name? Ananias, I think it was, and says, I want you to go bring the gospel to Saul of Tarsus, and I love his response because it's the response that I would have had. And he said, well, wait, who? Are you sure? Right, is there too much static on the line? Because everyone knew who Saul was, and Saul was persecuting Christians. And I'm not saying that he was going around, throwing eggs at them. I mean, he's having them killed. So this is a big thing. And so Ananias' response is human. It would have been my response, and hopefully everyone's response. It's very human. And so Jesus has to convince him and comfort him, saying, you'll be okay, trust me. I got things for him to do now. Don't worry about it. And that's what it is. So when we look at our own history, human history throughout the Bible, there's none of them in there that does it perfect and quite right. None. And this is why, to me, Peter is such a wonderful example, because, as everyone gets on Peter's case, I say, you know what, he's about the most human one in there. Yep. He gets some things right and he gets some things wrong. It sounds like everyone, and I know, including myself, right? That's it. So, we hit some, we miss some, and that's Peter. And we learn these things because of his impulsive nature. But that's okay, because lots of humans have impulsive nature. And we learn from that. So none of them, except for Jesus, gets it totally correct. Totally correct. Not Abraham, not Isaac, not Jacob, not Joseph. They're all marred. And it doesn't mean that they don't do wonderful and amazing things. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that they don't get it 100% right, because they're people. And no person does that. No person does get it 100% right. So even, we think about how revered David is, or David was, within the history of the ancient Hebrews. And my gosh, he did some hideous things. You can say, well, what about Moses? He did. But, Moses also had a marred up history. So none of us, including these pillars within the Bible, none except Jesus. And so as we continue through this section, and we go through sin and what it is and what it's not, hopefully we will get a better understanding of what it is, and it's that sin is not just this sinister shadow that lies behind every tree or under every rock waiting to pounce and attack us, but to understand it better in a Hebrew context. Because remember, that's what we are looking at, right? Whether it be the ancient Hebrews or whether it be the people in Jesus' time, right? Early first century. It is a very Hebrew understanding of what sin is, right? You might have other faiths, other religions that might look at sin or consider sin, and it might be something different. But for our context, this is what we're looking at. Because what Jesus taught about sin is very Jewish. And so we must take that in consideration as we go through this section. All right, next week I will have you notes for 11. And it's good to know I won't have to print them out for 12 because they're already done.
Thank you.
Thank you.